On the cliffs of Cornwall, where the sea never slept, stood a house of glass and stone. Locals called it the Lighthouse House, not because it guided ships, but because it had once been filled with light. Now it stood dim and silent, like a monument to something lost. Inside lived Richard Hale, a once renowned architect who had built homes designed to breathe sunlight and peace. But since the night his wife Clara died in an accident, his own home had stopped breathing. The silence inside seemed thicker than the sea fog outside. His 8-year-old daughter Grace hadn't eaten for 14 days. Not a crumb, not a sip of milk. She just lay there, small and pale, staring at the ceiling as if she were waiting for someone to return. The doctors came and went. The therapist spoke softly, then left quietly. The nannies lasted hours. Nothing helped. On the 12th morning, the head housekeeper, Mrs. Foster, carried a tray of untouched soup downstairs. Still nothing, she said. Richard didn't answer. He just stared out toward the grey horizon, where the wind howled against the glass like an uninvited memory. Upstairs, in Grace's room, a small white dog lay by the window, waiting. Waiting for movement, for warmth, for the sound of a child's laugh that had long vanished. When the next dawn came, the sea shone gold for a moment, a cruel contrast to the cold air inside. The front gate creaked open. A woman appeared, carrying a worn canvas bag and a quiet determination. Her name was Emma Collins. She had been sent by an agency to help in the kitchen for a few weeks. Mrs. Foster met her at the door, arms crossed. "You're late," she said sharply. "The bus broke down," Emma replied gently. Her voice carried neither apology nor defiance, just calm. "I had to walk from the village." Inside, she looked around. Marble floors, silver fixtures, everything spotless. And yet, it felt lifeless.
Mrs. Foster listed the rules in her usual tone. "You'll assist with meals, clean the kitchen, and never disturb Mr. Hale unless spoken to. And under no circumstances are you to enter the girl's room. Is that clear?" Emma nodded. "Yes, ma'am." But behind her quiet eyes was something steady, something that made Mrs. Foster pause. Not curiosity, not pity. Hope. When the older woman left, Emma stood alone in the silent kitchen. She washed her hands, tied her apron, and began to chop vegetables.
The sound of the knife, soft, rhythmic, filled the house like a heartbeat too long missing. In the reflection of the fridge door, she saw her own face, tired, sun-worn, but still alive. And perhaps, just perhaps, she thought, even the coldest houses can remember warmth, if someone is patient enough to wait. As the clock ticked toward noon, the faint scent of soup drifted upward, toward the room where a little girl lay in silence. The rain returned by noon, tapping softly against the glass walls of the house. The scent of Emma's soup filled the kitchen, carrot, thyme, a hint of rosemary, the kind of warmth that could make even the loneliest day feel less cruel. Mrs. Foster entered, her face drawn and tired from years of quiet service. "The meal for Mr. Hale goes upstairs. He won't eat unless it's brought exactly on time," she said, glancing at the clock. "I'll take it." Emma looked up from the counter. "Allow me," she offered gently. Mrs. Foster hesitated. No one had ever volunteered for that duty. "He doesn't like strangers in his study. I'll be careful." Emma's voice carried a steadiness that made refusal feel pointless. A moment later, she climbed the narrow staircase, tray in hand. Each step groaned softly beneath her feet, as though the house itself exhaled after holding its breath for too long. The door to the study stood half open. Inside, Richard sat at his desk, the glow of his computer reflecting on his pale face. His shoulders were rigid, his eyes hollow. Behind him, the storm blurred the sea into a sheet of shifting silver. "Your lunch, Mr. Hale," Emma said quietly. He didn't look up. "Leave it on the table." She obeyed. Her eyes moved briefly across the room, sketches of houses pinned on the walls, a dusty violin in the corner, and one photo frame beside the laptop. A woman with dark curls holding a laughing child. Emma felt her throat tighten. She whispered a single line, not for him to hear, but for herself. May the lost find their way home. When she turned to leave, his voice finally came. Rough. Unused. You're new. Yes, sir. Don't get comfortable. People don't stay long here. She paused at the door. Then maybe that's what needs to change. He said nothing, but his hand, which had been gripping the edge of the desk, loosened slightly. Downstairs, Mrs. Foster stood by the oven, arms folded. How was he? Lonely, Emma answered simply. The older woman sighed. He's been that way since Mrs. Hale's accident. The girl hasn't spoken since the funeral. She just, stopped. Stopped eating too? Emma asked softly. Mrs. Foster nodded. We've tried everything. The doctors, the therapists, the schools. Nothing. Mr. Hale spends his days hiding behind work. The house feels like it's sinking. Emma stirred the pot of soup in silence. The air hummed with a sorrow that had settled into every wall. That evening, as she wiped the counters clean, she heard a sound she hadn't heard before. Faint footsteps above, then a soft whimper, the kind only a child makes when her dreams hurt. Emma looked toward the staircase, hesitated and whispered, Not tonight, but soon. She turned off the lights, letting the kitchen fall into gentle darkness. Outside the sea kept roaring, but somewhere faint and fragile, another rhythm had begun. Morning came pale and heavy with mist. The waves crashed softly below the cliffs, and the smell of salt lingered through the corridors. Emma was already in the kitchen when Mrs. Foster entered, her hair pinned neatly, her hands trembling slightly as she carried a silver tray. Breakfast for Miss Grace, she said, her voice flat from repetition. It won't make a difference, but we still try. Emma glanced at the tray. Porridge, a slice of toast, milk untouched from yesterday. Everything neat, lifeless. Let me take it up this time, she said quietly. Mrs. Foster froze. No. Mr. Hale doesn't allow that. Emma met her eyes. Maybe it's time someone tried something different. For a moment only the clock ticked. Then Mrs. Foster sighed. If she screams, or if he finds out, I'll deny it. You never went upstairs, understand? Emma nodded. She lifted the tray carefully, her fingers steady, though her heart beat faster with each step. The corridor upstairs was lined with photographs. Richard and Clara on their wedding day, Grace as a baby in her mother's arms. All frozen moments of joy that now felt like ghosts. Grace's door was ajar. Emma pushed it gently. The room was pink and perfect. The kind of room love had once designed. Dolls in dresses, storybooks stacked on a shelf, curtains fluttering slightly with the breeze. And in the middle of it all lay a girl so still she might have been carved from porcelain.
Good morning, Grace, Emma whispered. No response, only the faint sound of breathing. I'm Emma. I help in the kitchen. I brought you breakfast. She set the tray on the nightstand, but Grace's eyes didn't move. Emma sat down on the edge of the chair, folding her hands in her lap. You know, she began softly, when I was little I stopped eating too. My mother called it the hunger of the heart. Said no food can help until someone listens.
A twitch, so small, most would have missed it, crossed Grace's eyelids. Emma smiled faintly. She used to make something simple for me. Bread with olive oil and salt. She called it healing bread. Said it reminded her that even broken things can still taste like home. Grace's lips parted slightly. Healing? Bread? The words came out like a sigh, dry and fragile, but alive. Emma's heart leapt. Yes, my love. Healing bread.
Would you like to smell it next time I make some? Grace didn't answer, but her eyes shifted. The first sign of life in 2 weeks. A flicker, small, but real. Mrs. Foster, who had crept halfway up the stairs, covered her mouth, fighting back tears. Emma stayed beside the bed, her voice calm as if speaking to the sea. You don't have to eat. I'll just sit here a while. So, you're not alone. And for the first time in that house, the silence didn't hurt. It breathed.
Downstairs, the kettle whistled softly, steam curling through the air. Upstairs, a little girl's eyes followed a stranger's voice, and something fragile, something almost lost, began to mend. The next morning, Cornwall woke beneath a pale sun. Light spilled through the kitchen window, scattering across polished marble and copper pots that had long forgotten laughter. Emma was already at the counter, sleeves rolled, flour on her hands. The air filled with the gentle rhythm of kneading, press, fold, breathe. It wasn't in the house rules, but something about this bread felt necessary. Mrs. Foster entered, holding her teacup like a shield. "What are you doing, Miss Collins?" Emma didn't look up. "Making something old, something my mother used to call healing bread." The older woman frowned. "We have chefs in London who send us meals every week. She won't eat anything." Emma's hands kept moving, steady and kind. "Maybe it's not the food that matters. Maybe it's the hands that make it." Mrs. Foster stared for a long moment, then quietly turned and left the kitchen door open, as if granting silent permission. When the bread was ready, Emma brushed it with olive oil, sprinkled sea salt, and watched it turn golden in the oven. The scent, warm, honest, human, rose through the hallways. It reached the stairway, the walls, and finally the pale room above. Grace stirred. For the first time, she turned her head toward the door. Minutes later, Emma climbed the steps carrying a small plate wrapped in linen. She knocked gently. "It's only me." The girl's eyes followed her as she entered. "Good morning, Grace," Emma said softly. "I've brought you something different today." She unwrapped the bread. The fragrance filled the air, rich and simple, the smell of a memory rather than a meal.
My grandmother said this bread doesn't heal the stomach, Emma explained, sitting beside the bed. It heals something deeper, the part of you that still remembers love. Grace blinked, uncertain. Her fingers twisted in the bedsheet. "It smells nice." "That's a start," Emma smiled. "Would you like to hold it? You don't have to eat, just hold it." Grace hesitated, then reached out, trembling slightly. The bread was warm, alive in her hands.
She closed her eyes, breathed in, and something inside her cracked, like frost melting. A single tear slipped down her cheek. Emma didn't rush her. She just whispered, "You're safe here, Grace. No one's asking you to be brave today." And then, a miracle small enough to miss if one blinked. The girl lifted a crumb to her lips, chewed, swallowed. Downstairs, Mrs. Foster froze halfway through setting the table, feeling something change in the air. Upstairs the silence broke, not with sound but with warmth, the kind that seeps into cold walls and teaches them to breathe again. Emma exhaled slowly, eyes closed. "That's it, my sweet girl. Just one piece at a time." Outside, the sea softened. Inside, a house that had known only grief began, faintly, tenderly, to remember hope. The scent of warm bread drifted through the upper hallway like a forgotten song. Richard Hale, bent over his drafting table, noticed it before he realized why it felt strange. It was the smell of something human, not disinfectant, not coffee gone cold. Something alive. He pushed his chair back, frowning. From below he heard faint voices, a sound he hadn't heard in months. The soft tone of a woman speaking gently, and then a child's breath. He stood. For the first time in weeks, his body seemed to move before his thoughts could stop it. At the top of the stairs, he saw the door to Grace's room slightly ajar. Inside, Emma sat beside his daughter's bed, and Grace, his fragile, silent Grace, was holding a piece of bread. Her lips moved, slow and deliberate. He froze. "Grace?" he whispered. The girl looked up. Crumbs clung to her small fingers. Her voice trembled as she spoke, barely audible. "Papa, I'm eating." The words hit him harder than any blow could. Richard felt his throat close, his breath catch. He stepped inside, almost afraid the moment would vanish if he blinked. Mrs. Foster stood in the doorway, hand over her mouth. Emma turned, her expression calm, grounded. "What is this?" Richard asked, his voice rough. "Who told you to—" He stopped mid-sentence. He couldn't finish. Emma met his gaze. She didn't need orders, Mr. Hale. She needed kindness. For a moment the world stood still. Only the sound of waves filled the silence. Richard looked at his daughter, her cheeks damp, her eyes bright for the first time since Clara's funeral. He sank to his knees beside the bed, every ounce of pride dissolving. "I have tried everything," he whispered. "Doctors, therapy, everything money could buy. But not this. Not just being here." Grace reached out, touched his hand with her flour-dusted fingers. "You're here now." Tears blurred his vision. "Yes," he breathed. "I'm here," he breathed. He felt Emma watching quietly from the side, not intruding, not claiming any miracle, just standing in the gentle light of it. When Richard finally turned to her, his voice was softer. "Who are you?" "Emma Collins," she said. "Kitchen staff. Or at least that's what the agency wrote." "And what did you give her?" "Bread," she answered simply, "and someone who stayed long enough to listen." He stared at her, unsure what to say, then gave a slow nod. The kind a man gives when pride has no place left to hide. Grace leaned against his shoulder, eyes closing. "Don't go back to work, Papa. Not yet." He swallowed hard. "I won't. Not tonight." Downstairs, Mrs. Foster wiped her eyes with the corner of her apron, whispering to herself, "Bless that girl." And as the waves rolled against the cliffs below, the house seemed to exhale, a soft, shuddering sigh of life returning. For the first time in years, light filled the room again. That night, the rain came gently, like forgiveness. The sea murmured outside the glass walls, and the house, once filled with emptiness, now carried the fragile rhythm of breathing again. Grace slept peacefully, her small hand clutching the edge of her father's sleeve, as if afraid he might disappear if she let go. Richard sat beside her bed, motionless, listening to the quiet that no longer felt cruel. Emma watched from the doorway. The lamplight touched her face softly, revealing lines of exhaustion, but also something like peace. Richard finally looked up. "I don't know how you did it," he said quietly. 2 weeks, nothing worked. Then you walked in, and suddenly she—" He broke off, his voice roughened by emotion. "She didn't need a cure," Emma said gently. "She needed someone to stay." He rubbed his eyes. "I thought I was staying. I never left this house." She stepped closer, her tone calm but firm. "You were here, Mr. Hale, but your heart wasn't. Grief makes people vanish long before they walk out the door." He looked at her for a long time, the truth heavy but freeing. "I built homes my whole life," he murmured, "but I forgot how to live in one." Emma smiled faintly. "Then maybe this is where you start again." For a while neither spoke. The rain whispered against the window, the sound steady and rhythmic, like the slow return of life itself. When Richard finally spoke, it was in a voice cracked open by memory. "My wife, Clara. She died in a car accident. I was supposed to pick her up. I was late because of a client. She tried to drive herself home. I've been punishing myself ever since." Emma didn't answer immediately. She just stood beside him, letting the confession find its place in the air. "You think being strong means pretending the pain isn't there," she said softly. "But your daughter doesn't need a strong man. She needs her father." He turned his head, meeting her eyes, not as an employer, not as a man of status, but as a human being trying to find his way back. "How do I do that?" he asked. "Start small," Emma said. "Stay, eat with her. Talk, even if it's about nothing. She'll follow your heart before she follows your words." He nodded, his gaze falling back on Grace. "I don't even know what she's dreaming about right now." Emma smiled. "Maybe she's dreaming of you finally staying for breakfast." For the first time, he let out a quiet laugh, uncertain but real. The sound seemed to warm the air. When she turned to leave, he said softly, "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," she replied, pausing at the door. "Tomorrow is when it really begins." She walked down the hall, her footsteps light, her shadow stretching behind her like a prayer. Downstairs, she placed a small bowl of dough on the counter to rise overnight. For tomorrow, she whispered, covering it with a cloth. Upstairs, Richard took his daughter's hand again. And this time, he didn't let go. The next morning arrived with a softness the cliffs of Cornwall hadn't seen in months. The fog lifted slowly, revealing streaks of sunlight that touched the windows like gentle fingers. In the kitchen, Emma stood at the counter, humming an old tune as she worked the dough she had left to rise overnight. The smell of yeast and salt filled the air, the scent of something alive. She brushed the top with olive oil, sprinkled coarse sea salt, and smiled. "Let's wake this house," she whispered. Mrs. Foster entered, tightening her shawl. "You're up early again?" Emma nodded. Habit and hope. When the bread went into the oven, warmth spread through every hallway like a memory finding its way home. Upstairs, Grace stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, catching a beam of sunlight on her blanket. She turned, half asleep, and murmured, "It smells like the seaside cafe Mum used to love." Richard, who had fallen asleep beside her bed, blinked in surprise. "You remember that?" Grace smiled faintly. "She always said bread was like hugs you can eat." He swallowed, his throat tight. She did. Downstairs, Emma called gently from the doorway. "Breakfast is ready, if anyone's brave enough to taste something new." Grace sat up. "Can I go, Papa?" He grinned, unsure how to smile properly anymore. "Only if I come with you." When they entered the kitchen, Mrs. Foster nearly dropped her teacup. "Well," she gasped, "this feels different already." On the table lay 3 simple plates, warm slices of golden bread, a drizzle of oil, and small bowls of coarse salt. The scent wrapped around them like sunlight. Emma placed a piece on Grace's plate. "No rules today. Just taste if you want to." Grace pinched off a corner, tasted it, and her eyes lit up. "It's warm," she said, laughing for the first time in months. The sound hit Richard like wind through an open window. He hadn't realized how much he missed it until that very moment. Mrs. Foster sniffled, pretending to busy herself with the kettle. "You've done something to this house, Miss Collins." Emma smiled. "I didn't do anything." She did. She nodded at Grace. She remembered how to be happy. Grace giggled, holding up her bread. "Papa, your turn." Richard raised an eyebrow. "I don't think I remember how." "Then today's your first lesson," Emma teased. "Be gentle with the dough. And with yourself." He laughed softly, took a bite, and looked at his daughter. "It's perfect." "No," Emma said, shaking her head. "It's real." "That's better." Mrs. Foster chuckled for the first time in years. "I'll take real over perfect any day." And so, in that quiet kitchen on the Cornish coast, laughter returned. It echoed through the halls, across the stone floors, up the stairs, the kind of laughter that chases away ghosts. Outside, even the sea seemed calmer, as though it too had been waiting for this sound. For the first time since Clara's death, the house truly felt like a home. A week passed, and the house on the cliffs no longer sounded like grief. It breathed again. In the footsteps across the hall, in Grace's laughter echoing through the garden, in the kettle that never seemed to cool. Richard spent his mornings in the kitchen now, a place he had avoided for years. He didn't wear his suits anymore. Instead, he rolled up his sleeves and learned the rhythm of ordinary things. Slicing fruit, making tea, burning toast at least twice a day. Grace called him Chef Papa, and every time she said it, his heart healed a little more. Emma watched from the side, quietly content. She never sought praise or attention. She simply kept the house warm. Yet behind her calm eyes, something stirred. A thought she had been trying to silence for days. That evening, as the sun sank into the horizon, painting the sea in gold and rose, she found Richard standing on the terrace. He was holding 2 mugs of tea. "For you," he said. "Thank you," Emma replied, taking one. The wind tousled her hair. She brushed it back, smiling faintly. "She's changing so quickly," he said. "It's like she's alive again." "She always was," Emma answered softly. "She just needed to know someone would stay." He looked at her then, really looked. "You've done more for this house than anyone ever could. I don't even know how to thank you." She hesitated, then said, By remembering what you've learned. He frowned slightly. And what's that? That a house doesn't come alive because of glass or stone, she said, gazing toward the waves. It lives because people choose to stay inside it, through noise, through silence, through everything. He nodded, the words landing deeper than she knew. You sound like Clara, he whispered. Emma smiled sadly. Maybe love has a way of sending reminders. The next morning, Emma came to the kitchen without her apron. Her small bag rested by the door. Mrs. Foster looked up, startled. You're leaving? Emma nodded. My mother's unwell. I have to go home for a while. When Grace heard, her face fell. She ran to Emma, hugging her tightly. You'll come back, won't you? Emma knelt, meeting her eyes. Of course, I promise. She held out her pinky finger. A small promise, but one that never expires. Grace hooked her little finger around Emma's. Then you have to keep it. Richard stood behind them, his expression unreadable, though his eyes betrayed both gratitude and fear of losing the light she had brought. You'll always have a place here, he said quietly. Emma smiled. Take care of each other and keep baking, that's how hope stays warm. She left as the sea breeze swept through the garden, carrying the scent of salt and rising bread. Days passed. Then, one grey morning, as Grace sat drawing at the kitchen table, the front gate creaked open. Small footsteps ran across the gravel. Papa, Grace cried. She's back. Richard turned, and there she was. Emma, her hair windswept, her eyes shining. Before words could form, Grace threw herself into her arms. You kept your promise. Emma laughed softly. I told you. Some promises are baked into the heart. Mrs. Foster wiped her eyes discreetly. Richard stepped forward, his voice steady now. Welcome home. The three of them stood together as sunlight broke through the clouds. The house glowed, golden and alive. On the wall, Grace's newest drawing hung beside the fridge. 3 figures and a dog beneath a shining sun. Underneath, written in uneven letters, home is where someone stays. And as the waves whispered below the cliffs of Cornwall, the house, at long last, breathed freely again. Sometimes miracles don't arrive as thunder or light. Sometimes they come as bread shared between hearts.